Hey, everybody. It is Monday, March 24th. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Wanunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. I want to begin by wishing all of you a happy National Cheesesteak Day for all who celebrate.
Moshe, I think you probably could guess that I'm not a huge cheesesteak person, but I did have them back in the day when I used to go to the Michigan football games. I always used to get them at the stadium. For some reason, it was like my go-to at the Big House.
That, of course, is Ann Arbor, but those people I know in Philadelphia will tell you there's no competition when it comes to cheesesteak. You got to get your cheesesteak in Philly, where the cheesesteak was invented nearly 100 years ago, which, by the way, the original cheesesteak was invented by Pat Oliveri. He apparently had a hot dog stand with his brother, was bored with hot dogs, was like, let's go get some beef and grill it, make a sandwich. They would add provolone a few years later, and so give birth to the Philly cheesesteak. And now there's a lot of options there, and it's led to some interesting political snafus over the years, Jill. Infamously, John Kerry, when he was running for president, asked for Swiss cheese on his cheesesteak. And, people in Pennsylvania would not let him live it down.
All right, speaking of politics, let's get to some headlines here. In a new executive order released late Friday, President Trump targets lawyers and law firms who are challenging him in court. What is the goal and the concern from the legal community? Meanwhile, with Democrats still divided on the direction of their party, AOC and Bernie Sanders were on tour this weekend, rallying tens of thousands across the Southwest.
Yeah, we should note AOC turned 35 in the fall, meaning she is now officially eligible constitutionally to run for president.
Some good news from the Vatican. Pope Francis is finally discharged from the hospital after 5 weeks, where he had some very close calls. Back here in the U.S., Tesla owners are trading in cars at record rates amid continued backlash against CEO Elon Musk and his work with the federal government. In Washington, President Trump suggests he'll pay overtime out of his own pocket for the formerly stranded astronauts whose trip got extended from 8 days to 9 months. And the nonprofit behind Sesame Street is confronting what executives describe as a perfect storm of problems that have led to financial strains.
The headline was, "Why is Big Bird so sad?" in one of the papers.
American women are giving up on marriage. We'll tell you why.
Not all of them, but more than have historically.
And finally, George Foreman, championship boxer and grill pitchman, died over the weekend at the age of 76. A look back on his life.
And his 5 sons, all named George as well, Jill.
And Moshe is on the Stain History.
Your clue today, leave the gun, take the cannoli.
Even I know that one. All right, we begin in Washington with an executive order that President Trump issued late Friday against attorneys and law firms that are seen as challenging administration actions in court. A memo issued late Friday night threatened sanctions against those in the legal community that he believes have unfairly or unethically challenged his administration. The presidential order directs the U.S. Attorney General and Homeland Security Secretary to pursue ethics challenges against lawyers who they accuse of bringing meritless cases or making arguments that they say are not backed by fact, including in immigration courts. The president specified that they should be reviewing lawsuits from the past 8 years since the beginning of Trump's first term to find potential targets. The order reads in part, quote, "I hereby direct the Attorney General to seek sanctions against attorneys and law firms who engage in frivolous, unreasonable, and vexatious litigation against the United States." The directive comes as the Trump administration faces more than 130 lawsuits over its efforts to dismantle agencies and diversity programs, freeze spending, fire federal workers, and deport immigrants without due process. It's also facing legal challenges related to its aggressive immigration efforts, like more targeted arrests and deporting people sometimes without following typical processes. The concern is that this would have a chilling effect and dissuade law firms from representing any clients challenging the federal government for fear of retribution from the administration. The president has long accused Democratic-leaning lawyers and law firms of being politically motivated. He is ramping up these accusations against those who represent clients and take cases against him. New Jersey's Attorney General Matthew Platkin, who has led several lawsuits against the Trump administration, called the memo an unprecedented and frankly outrageous attempt to threaten lawyers simply for doing their jobs. Earlier this month, Trump began issuing executive orders revoking security clearances for major U.S. law firms. Security clearances are needed to review government contracts for corporate clients. So that means that these firms were at risk of losing a lot of clients. He also banned their employees from federal buildings and from working for the federal government. Several firms targeted so far had done work for Democrats or Trump opponents. One of them targeted was Covington and Burling. It's a large firm that had done legal work for Jack Smith, the former special counsel who indicted Trump over the last couple of years.
Yeah, so one executive order against Covington and Burling, another one against Paul Weiss. Some of you in the legal world may have heard about this one. The Paul Weiss firm has had ties to a lawyer who pushed for Trump to be indicted, also filed litigation against January 6 rioters. And we should know these executive orders are coming one after another against several firms, and already suits are being filed in regards to these executive orders. And judges have already begun to declare some of these executive orders unconstitutional, as in the president cannot be constitutionally targeting specific law firms with these executive orders. But notably, the Paul Weiss firm came to a deal last week. And we should note Paul Weiss, very famous firm, goes way back, handles a lot of major cases. They ended up getting their security clearance reinstated when they struck a deal last week with the Trump administration. They have now agreed at Paul Weiss to do $40 million in pro bono work for the government on issues that Trump deems important. So they've come to an agreement on a couple of issues like anti-Semitism and a couple other issues that the firm says, sure, we'll do $40 million of work for you on that. You just have to give us our security clearance back. So the president withdrew his executive action in regards to Paul Weiss, many seeing it as the firm here clearly making a deal to avoid losing a lot of business. The firm has long been dominated by Democrats doing work for Democrats. It's been known at being at the forefront of civil rights legislation, especially against the government. But the Weiss firm facing a lot of criticism from inside the legal world for bending to the administration. They're being accused of not standing up for the rule of law, ethical standards, especially as it comes, as judges are saying, these executive orders are not constitutional. But the chairman of the firm stands by it, saying they reaffirm the firm's principles here. So we mentioned Covington and Burling. We mentioned Paul Weiss. There's another firm you may have heard of called Perkins Coie. They had their security clearance revoked. They had done work representing the Hillary Clinton campaign back in 2016. They played a role in commissioning the famous Steele dossier about Trump's alleged interactions with Russia. The Steele dossier, of course, a lot of that turned out not to be true. Now, Perkins Coie has not engaged in a deal here with Trump. They're suing him in federal court, and they won a partial victory in the last week as a U.S. district judge froze parts of the executive order Trump signed against them. So you have one firm fighting, you have one firm striking a deal here. The larger issue, though, is that this is coming as the Trump administration really increasingly challenges judges, the judiciary. We've been talking about it with that case related to the deportations and the use of the Alien Enemies Act. Trump personally has been disparaging, has been attacking federal judges on social media. You've seen the criticism from Trump administration officials in regards to judges. So the perception here is this is now a different part of the attack here, trying to dissuade law firms from taking on cases for clients who have issues with the government. As you mentioned, Jill, a chilling effect. And so that's why there's some concern among some lawyers I spoke to this weekend about the potential impact of this case, even as some judges say, the executive order is unconstitutional. Are there other things that the administration, the federal government can be doing to make life difficult for law firms that challenge the administration in too many ways? Now, again, the Trump administration would say, this is just a warning to you guys not to take on, cases that have no, real merit. But we should note there are other ways to deal with lawyers and law firms that take on cases with no merit, as opposed to literally the U.S. Attorney General dealing with it. Nonetheless, something to watch closely here, especially, again, as you've seen the pushback from the White House and the administration, the Justice Department, on the federal judiciary, including the case that we're still watching with Judge Boasberg, the federal judge who has frozen the administration's ability to use the 1798 law, Alien Enemies Act, to deport people without seeing a judge, sending them to El Salvador. That's a story we told you about in recent weeks. The administration intimating that they may not follow through with certain orders, though they claim they have followed his orders. The judge says no. Just a lot happening here, and it led to what we told you last week. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, effectively warning the White House to continue to follow how the law is written, follow the court process, as opposed to criticize judges openly and, like we saw last week, a call for the impeachment of that judge.
All right, and sticking with politics across the aisle, the Democrats continue to be divided on the direction that their party should take after a decisive loss last year. And some Democrats are taking their ideas on the road. Former presidential candidate and Senator Bernie Sanders and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a member of the left-leaning squad, have launched what they are calling their Fight Oligarchy Tour. They drew crowds of tens of thousands at events around the country this weekend. In Denver, Sanders acknowledged that of the hundreds of rallies he has hosted, that was one of the biggest. Sanders and AOC are two of the most high-profile, progressive, and anti-establishment lawmakers on the left. And their message is that the Democratic Party needs to fight against President Trump and Republicans in the House and the Senate. AOC, as she is known, talked about her plan, which she says opponents call radical, but she says is common sense. Among her priorities, no American should go bankrupt from illness, earn less than the cost of living, or rely on public programs to subsidize low wages. But more importantly, she said Democrats need to unite and push back against the current administration, especially in the light of the move by Chuck Schumer and some Senate Democrats to vote with Republicans to prevent a government shutdown. Many members of the party were upset that they didn't have a better game plan to fight Trump, given that he needed Democratic votes in the Senate. Here is a bit from AOC's speech in Arizona this weekend.
I want you to look at every level of office around and support Democrats who fight, because those are the ones who can actually win against Republicans.
She spoke about the Democratic Party not as progressive versus moderate, but as those who are choosing to aggressively go after President Trump and those who think it is better to be more cautious.
This internal battle among Democrats really taking on a new level with Chuck Schumer's choice earlier this month to join Republicans in passing that Trump-led spending deal to keep the government open. He acknowledged that it was basically damned if you do, damned if you don't, that ultimately he didn't like the package, but ultimately if Democrats shut down the government, that Trump, in his eyes, could do much more damage to Democratic priorities, keep the government shut down, and really gut a number of departments across the government, keep the shutdown going for a while they blame it on Democrats. Nonetheless, a number of Democrats, including AOC in this case, and other Democrats said, you should have still had a plan, Chuck Schumer. He needed you to pass this, and you should have come in with prepared things that you were demanding, get a couple of concessions out of them, as opposed to not really having a plan, saying you were going to fight, then not fighting, and disappointing a bunch of the base, including House Democrats who were like, oh, I thought we're fighting this. And so ultimately, you've seen Schumer. He's going on a book tour. He has a new book out about anti-Semitism, been doing a bunch of interviews. He was on Meet the Press over the weekend and got a lot of questions related to whether he's going to step down. There's some Democrats saying, man, you've been around too long and you're not the person to, handle this fight for us. He says he's absolutely not stepping down. He says that, we all respect differing opinions here. And so you see a really interesting divide here happening, Jill, in Washington among the kind of more progressive element as well as the more moderate element. Which direction do Democrats go in? So
a real question here, Moshe. Democrats don't control the House. They don't control the Senate. They do not control the executive branch.
And hold on, and let's throw in there, Jill, the conservatives also have a 6-3 majority in the Supreme Court.
So besides for winning more seats in the midterm elections and taking back the Senate or the House or both, what really could they have done? Because what incentive do Republicans have to negotiate with them? They were fine shutting down the government. So I'm not here to defend Chuck Schumer, but what really was a realistic alternative?
Well, I mean, you lay out the dilemma that Democrats have, which is they don't run anything in Washington. It's one of the reasons Democrats across the country are so upset at them, but they have to be honest with themselves. They don't have much power besides filing lawsuits. Now, the power they did have, Jill, was in the Senate. Why? Because while Republicans have a majority there, 53 seats to 47 seats, many things that need to get passed in the Senate need a 60-seat majority, filibuster-proof. Filibuster meaning you effectively are able to individually block legislation or as party block legislation until something gets 60 votes. So Democrats had to provide about 8 votes there based on the way things went in the Senate. So technically, Republicans needed Democrats. Now, Republicans are saying we didn't need them. whatsoever. We were going to blame them regardless for shutting things down. But if Schumer and Senate Democrats had a plan several weeks out saying, we know you need us. These are the things we demand. We also have an interest in not shutting down the government, but you need to talk to us. You cannot just do what they did, which is Trump, House Republicans, Senate Republicans all got together, came up with their own plan, ignored Democrats altogether. So they wanted to see more of a fight. I think the party base did. You also saw a number of Democrats on Capitol Hill they wanted, and they felt that effectively Schumer conceded defeat too early and also didn't really go in with a plan. And that's an interesting contrast from, we began here with AOC and Bernie Sanders, these rallies across the Southwest. Jill, some of these rallies getting more than 10,000 people. And reporters I know who have covered them say more energy at them than some of the Kamala Harris rallies in the fall.
And this all comes amid a divide on the future of the party for Democratic voters as well. 45% of Democrats say they want the party to move in a more moderate direction. 29% say they prefer more liberal direction. And 22% say that the Democratic Party should stay the same. Those numbers are from a Gallup survey last month. Looking at the numbers, it shows a large majority of the party is dissatisfied. And much of that frustration is aimed at Congress, which has been unable to effectively push back on Trump's policies. Support from Democrats' base for the party is at a historic low, according to polling. In modern history, Democrats have historically been more approving of their party than Republicans, but that all shifted about 2 decades ago.
Yeah, Democrats now at low levels that you saw Republicans at after John McCain lost in 2008 to Obama, after Mitt Romney lost in 2012 to Obama, and you saw the rise of the Tea Party movement. The Tea Party movement, you might remember them originally like Michelle Bachmann, Rick Santorum, Sarah Palin, and then, of course, Donald Trump comes along in 2015. The base movement saying that, whatever you guys are doing in Washington doesn't click with us. You guys are out of touch with us, and you're not winning elections. So now you see Democrats at that level of disapproval for their own party. You're seeing this populism. You're certainly seeing from Bernie Sanders and AOC. And while the numbers you laid out there show more Democrats want the party to go moderate than go liberal, you do see this energy on the base. And remember that in 2015, 2016, some of the lessons the Republicans thought they learned from 12 and 08 was, how do we reach out to the middle? How do we run a more moderate campaign? They were looking at Marco Rubio as the future. And who comes along? Donald J. Trump. And he completely remakes the party and was told in 2015 and 2016, you're out of touch with this party. He manages to win the nomination, manages to win the presidency, wins again in 2024. And so you do see people on the left looking at that being like, well, we're told, AOC is like, I'm told, I'm radical. I think this is common sense. And there are interesting comparisons between the way AOC and Bernie Sanders are and the way Trump is. They have some of the similar goals in terms of reaching out on behalf of the workers, saying globalization has hurt us. They have different solutions, of course, to all of that. They both tend to like to spend a lot, both on the Trump side as well as on the Sanders AOC side. So there's interesting comparisons there as we look at it. It's still very early on, but this is shaping up to be the fight in the next coming couple of years here, as well as 2028. You got Pete Buttigieg on the more moderate end. You got Gavin Newsom, who was on the more liberal end, who, as we've been talking about, is making a move towards the middle. And then you sort of have the AOCs of the world. Again, I watched one of these rallies over the weekend, Jill. She sounds like somebody who could run for president in a few years, or at least be on the ticket as a VP potentially. She has a lot of energy behind her. And, it's interesting because she really understands social media. Again, making a comparison here to Trump in a way that Trump understands. And there was that interesting story we told folks in November that her district, there were so many people in her district that voted for her and Donald Trump. And AOC made a point on Instagram being like, wait, how do you guys vote for both of us? And, what people were pointing to was, you guys are both authentic. You both feel like fighters for us. So people looking at more tactics and rhetoric than, actual policies in some cases. It's the feeling people get from somebody. So some really interesting things happening there. Jill, I'll leave you with this soundbite from Chuck Schumer when I was on Capitol Hill a couple of weeks ago, when the president was giving his address. I said to Schumer, do you guys have a problem? You have no leader for this party. Here's my question. Here's how Chuck answered it.
Is one of the issues you face as the party right now is that there's no leader of the party?
We have a lot of good leaders, and a lot of good leaders in the Senate, in the House, and in the governor's office. We don't want just one. We want a lot. We got it.
So, Jill, the answer there from Chuck Schumer is they have lots of great leaders. They don't need one leader, which is what you say when you don't have a leader.
All right, time for the speed read from CNN. Pope Francis has finally been released from the hospital after battling complications from double pneumonia for 5 weeks. On Sunday, he returned to the Vatican to continue his recovery, which will likely take months. Before leaving the hospital, he waved to people from his balcony in his first public appearance in weeks. He looked frail and struggled to speak, although he was able to thank the crowd for their prayers and support. He also offered a blessing to the crowd that was gathered outside of the hospital. The Pope is 88 years old. He was admitted to the hospital on February 14th with a severe respiratory infection, and his medical team says that his condition has since stabilized.
They had some very precarious moments. He was put on a breathing machine multiple times. I mean, there are people saying that he wasn't going to make it at some points, but he has been able to pull off quite a recovery here. Before going home to the Vatican, he visited a basilica that is special to him. He usually goes there before and after trips abroad, offered his first prayer in weeks on Sunday, saying he experienced the patience of the Lord during the hospitalization. He said patience is necessary to get through the most difficult and painful situations. He acknowledged the care of his doctors and health workers. So now a long road to recovery here for the Pope, but he's got some busy days ahead here with Good Friday and Easter coming up in the next few weeks.
From the Washington Post, Tesla owners are trading in their cars at higher rates amid backlash against owner Elon Musk. In March, car trade-ins surged 2 months after Musk joined the Trump administration as a key advisor and the leader of Doge. As we've been reporting here in the podcast, protesters have also vandalized cars and storefronts in Tesla facilities across the country. Last week, a Tesla charging station was set on fire. Tesla shares have lost 40% of their value since last year. Vehicle sales have also fallen. Last Thursday night, Musk called an all-hands meeting with Tesla employees. He addressed some of those issues and tried to reassure workers that they are still in good hands and to hold on to their stock.
Yeah, don't sell your stock, he says, even though some shareholders and some board members, including his brother, have sold a bunch of shares over the course of the past few weeks. Now, the market was at record highs, but ultimately, that certainly reflects, confidence when the people who own millions of shares are selling their shares. He says, hold on here. Ultimately, Tesla has a very bright future. We're working on self-driving cars, automated driving. We're ahead of the competition here. And we are going to make it through this whole thing. Now, one of the big questions being asked in the market is, how long will Elon stay doing this stuff for the administration, given that he's got multiple businesses to run, like 4 of them, and Tesla is, having a difficult time. Now, as much as Tesla's having a difficult time, some of his other businesses are benefiting so far. SpaceX in particular is in a position for many future federal contracts here as they continue to do work for NASA and other aspects of the administration. The Pentagon is also discussing using SpaceX technology to move military cargo around the globe. SpaceX's Starlink satellite is eligible for billions in federal funding here as part of the government's effort to put broadband in rural areas. Effectively, Elon, no surprise, was shut out during the latter Biden era. You also have heard talk, we've talked about on this podcast, over the FAA. They're talking about using Starlink and SpaceX technology as they try to upgrade systems that are in dire need of improvement over there at the FAA and the Department of Transportation. SpaceX is also heavily involved in the new NASA priority, which is getting back to the moon and then getting to Mars in the coming years. So a lot happening, both positive and negative there around Elon. But certainly right now, the Tesla situation is not looking great for the company, at least in the short term, especially as you see more and more of these bumper stickers on the road. Jill, if you look for Elon Musk-related Tesla bumper stickers, people who want to keep their Teslas, not trade them in. There are bumper stickers like, I bought this before I knew Elon was crazy, vintage Tesla pre-madness edition, here for zero emissions, not Elon. Anyway, so on and so forth. People who like their Teslas but don't approve of Elon Musk. They're trying to find a middle ground. They're also trying to, frankly, we've talked about the violence and the attacks and stuff. They're trying to ensure their car doesn't get keyed in the parking lot.
Everyone I know who has a Tesla is obsessed with it as a car, but
Yes.
regardless of what they think of Elon Musk. At least prior to him coming out to support Donald Trump, people would show off their Teslas, just all of the cool things. Have you been in a Tesla? It was a status symbol in a lot of ways. And it's incredible just to watch this culturally, to see what has happened to this brand.
It's fascinating, but I will say this is probably worth a whole separate historical podcast, Jill. If we are going to start to judge people based on the CEOs and founders and leaders of the car companies and the car that they drive, I got some stories to tell you about who designed the Volkswagen Beetle, a guy named Adolf Hitler.
I was going to say, everyone driving around in Mercedes and Audis.
Or Henry Ford, who was the most rabid anti-Semite and friend of Hitler and the founder of Ford Motor Company. I could go on. And by the way, we could go across industries here. So definitely some people who are like, can I separate the founder and CEO from the car itself?
And by the way, I have never seen more Cybertrucks on the road. I used to wonder who was going to get them. I have seen so many recently.
Well, you're on Long Island.
We're representing the Cybertruck.
Yes, you are.
I used to think it was just the same person that I was seeing, but now I'm seeing a lot of them that I'm like, no, it's not just the same person.
The sales there have been pretty significant in the last 2 years.
Okay, from Reuters, last week we told you about NASA astronauts Sunny Williams and Butch Wilmore, how they were not paid overtime after their 8-day space mission turned into 286 days. They just got their regular annual salary of about $152,000 plus $5 every day that they were in space. It's an incidentals allowance. It totaled about $1,430 for more than 8 months.
Total, not like per day. $1,430 for the entire extra stay in space.
Well, President Trump on Friday said he hadn't heard that and suggested that he would pay them out of his own pocket if he had to. But it is unclear what overtime pay would amount to. Yeah,
the details are unclear. He got a question in the Oval Office on Friday from a reporter saying, hey, you heard these guys only got paid $5 extra a day? And he's like, whoa, I didn't hear that. If I have to do it, I will pay them. Now, we'll follow up on this. I imagine there'll be a lot of follow up on this in terms of what do they deem the value is? Can he get NASA or some aspect of the government to pay them more? And then, of course, he has the personal offer there. So we'll continue to monitor that. And frankly, whether they desire it. And, to the two of them, it was a dream to be in space that long. So will they even ask, or take extra money for their time in space? We shall find out.
My bet is that they won't.
They're scientists. They just got to spend their dream. What they thought was 8 days. They got to spend 8 months, and they're so thankful for it. But nonetheless, I imagine I won't be surprised if this week or next week you'll see the astronauts whenever they're ready head to Washington, visit the White House. Let's see what comes of it.
From the New York Times, Sesame Street's facing serious financial troubles. Executives are calling it the perfect storm, leading the company to cut about 20% of its staff, about 100 people. Sesame Workshop, which is the nonprofit responsible for all of the Sesame Street favorite characters, just lost a contract with HBO, which has paid about $30 to $35 million a year for the past decade to have rights to the show. The children's TV landscape has changed dramatically over the past few years. Shows like Bluey and Cocomelon far outpace Sesame Street's viewership, and YouTube is eating up more of children's attention as well. Clearly, whoever wrote this is tapped in at least to what's going on in my house.
I was going to say.
YouTube is it's embarrassing to admit what goes on.
and even the talk, my daughter's 18 months old, among parents with kids kind of 3 and under is Ms. Rachel, right? Ms. Rachel on YouTube. I was actually looking to see how many views she's getting versus Sesame Street on YouTube. And she's crushing Sesame Street. Some of her most recent videos have 50 to 100 million views on them. And a lot of these Sesame Street videos have 1 million or 500,000 views. Probably no surprise that she recently did a collaboration where Elmo shows up on Miss Rachel's set and they sing some songs together. Miss Rachel, by the way, has become, for parents of older kids, has become this phenomenon. She wears these overalls and a pink shirt and a pink headband, and kids are obsessed with learning from her. So Sesame Street looking for, what's the theme song? Sunny Days. They're looking for a return to their sunny days right now. They're going to have a reimagined look in the next year, apparently, to compete. We'll see what happens. The chief executive there at Sesame Street saying they're not going to go away. They've been around since 1969, one of the longest running programs on television. They have weathered financial stresses before. And so they had this HBO deal that fell through. Also, they get some of their funding from the federal government, and They had a grant from USAID, which we've told you, Trump has effectively killed most of that or cut off the funding. They also are looking at the administration at making further cuts to government-funded public media, things like the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And so there's concern there in terms of funding, but Sesame says they're going to persevere here.
Moshe, as soon as you could get Olivia into Bluey, do it. It's one of the better kids shows. I even like it as an adult.
I hear great things about Bluey. We are, at 18 months, we're still trying to tread carefully on screen time. We're not like a no screen time household, but we're selective so far with screen time, including like when we're exhausted and we're like, fine, just you need to watch something for 20 minutes.
From the Wall Street Journal, American women are living the single life more than ever. The percent of women ages 18 to 40 who are single was 51% in 2023. That's up from 42% in 2000. And this is all according to census data from the Aspen Economic Strategy Group. So what is behind this trend? In part, it is due to a rise in earning power among women and a decline in the social stigma related to being single. Overall, women report being less keen on marriage than their male counterparts. In a 2023 Pew survey, nearly half of women said being married is not important for a fulfilling life. Just 39% of men agreed. That's 10% less. But marriage rates for both men and women are in decline. Some say it's because both genders have higher standards for marriage, with dating apps making people feel like there's always a better option out there, although men seem more satisfied with their options. Half of college-educated women in a 2023 survey said that they were single because they couldn't find someone that met their expectations, while less than a quarter of single men said the same. And Moshe, comes as more women attend college than men. They're making more money. They're buying houses alone and focusing on their careers. And there are also growing divides in men and women's political beliefs and affiliations, how they see what a family should look like, all in today's polarized climate.
Yeah, there's been some numbers that have circulated a lot on social media in the last week or two showing where white single women are politically versus basically everyone else in society, much more liberal on a number of issues than everyone else. Jill, I think the bottom line, and in the Wall Street Journal story, I should note, it's a really interesting read. The headline is American Women Are Giving Up on Marriage. And they say that the bottom line for many women is that a rise in earning power, a decline in social stigma for being single, many more women in college and more educated than men, they would rather be alone than with a man who they believe holds them back in some way. And you're seeing this increasingly among Gen Z. Gen Z women were the ones who apparently have started a trend called boy sober, getting off dating altogether, caring much more about self-improvement, friendship, finding happiness alone. And we're already seeing this among younger generations. We've talked about this, the CDC numbers, that teens these days are having much less sex, to be blunt, than previous generations, an overall decline in teenage relationships, a change in priority here. And so what this means, what this portends for society is going to be very interesting here. But you are seeing the result of trend lines over the last few decades. And this is certainly something that came up last year in our interview podcast with Jonathan Haidt of Anxious Generation. He's a professor. He's delved into Gen Z, anxiety, smartphones, a whole bunch of the trend lines. He says that, you have an entire generation of men that have been left behind. It's actually one of the reasons for the political divide, where young men have gone right and young women have gone left. And so all this focus on basically ensuring and lifting up historically groups that weren't receiving education, weren't receiving a fair shake. Now you have a bunch of young men who feel left behind because there's not much in the way of programs specifically geared towards men. But now you have some universities that say, like, literally, if we were to go off of normal numbers, 75% plus of our incoming class would just be women. And so they've had to make exceptions to try to get to some level of equal distribution of men and women in incoming classes. But there are larger issues at play here. But it's a fascinating societal analysis in this Wall Street Journal piece.
Scott Galloway from the Pivot podcast talks about this all the time. And one of the things that he points out is that men who are college educated, for example, usually have a lot less of an issue dating or marrying a woman who didn't go to college. But the reverse is not true. Women who go to college or have a master's degree tend to not want to necessarily partner with somebody who doesn't have a college degree.
And as the trend lines continue, that there's many more women graduating from college than men, you can see how this is netting up.
And finally, from People, George Foreman, the two-time heavyweight boxing champion, Olympic gold medalist, and namesake of the George Foreman Grill, has died at the age of 76. His family wrote on Instagram, a devout preacher, a devoted husband, a loving father, and a proud grand and great-grandfather. He lived a life marked by unwavering faith, humility, and purpose. Foreman was born in 1949 in Texas. He grew up in a poor household in Houston. He dropped out of school at age 15 and was involved in petty crime. He eventually signed up for Job Corps and got his GED, learning carpentry and bricklaying. And that's when he trained as a boxer, which he said was to lose weight and become a better street fighter.
So at age 19, at the Mexico City Summer Olympics in 1968, he wins Olympic gold in boxing. He would go on to become a heavyweight champ, dominating boxing for a number of years there in the late 60s, early 70s. He would lose in the famous fight, the Rumble in the Jungle in Africa, to Muhammad Ali. He would then a couple years later have a near-death experience after a boxing match, leading him to become an ordained minister, which he does for about a decade. Doesn't make enough money, basically running out of money. So he comes back to boxing in his late 30s, becomes the oldest heavyweight champ at the age of 45. So you might remember him boxing in the 90s. He would retire finally in 97, has an incredible record, I think 76-5 in boxing. But many of us would come to know him for his entrepreneurship. I, among many people in college, went to college with the George Foreman Grill. Jill, did you have one of them?
One existed in my house.
Yeah. Everyone at one point between like the years 1995 and 2015-ish had a George Foreman Grill in their house. There apparently more than 100 million have been sold. I would imagine that number is probably dated at this juncture. At one point, Foreman said he was making $5 million a month on the grill alone. He launched it back in the mid-90s. So he had this whole entrepreneurship thing going on. Personally, he was married 4 different times, had 12 kids overall. Notably, Jill, all his daughters have different names. One is named Georgina, but then his sons, he has 5 sons, they're all named George. George Jr., George III, George IV, George V, and George VI. Even though they're literally all the same generation and they're all brothers. Why he named them all George? Well, he's offered a few different explanations for that. So he has a book he's put out, George Foreman's Guide to Life. And he said the decision went back to realizing the man who raised him was not his biological father. So he says that he wanted to plant something with his children that they could never lose. He wanted a foundation for all of them by giving them all the same name. Now, they did have nicknames. George Jr. is Junior. George III is called Monk. They all have their various names. Apparently on his website, he offered a different explanation where he said, I wanted them to all have something in common, I guess, besides their genes. He wanted them to live by the motto, if one of us goes up, we all go up together. If one of us goes down, we all go down together. So there's that. He then joked at one point that he gave them the same name because he's been punched so many times in the head, and it was going to be hard to remember their names. So anyway, if you're curious as to why George Foreman named his 5 sons all George, multiple explanations. We should know 2 of his grandsons also named George. So there's like 7 Georges. I
kind of buy the argument of giving them like a head start. I don't even know if you argued that, but that's what I'm gonna go
that was
with.
Not one of them that I brought up, but like he might have said that at some point.
Like if they had to introduce themselves as George Foreman, yeah. I feel like everyone knows who that is, versus Foreman is a relatively common last name.
Let's hope that will is airtight, though, because the fight over the George Foreman Grill Empire will begin in court sometime soon if that's not airtight. All right, now time for On This Day in History. We begin in 1806. Lewis and Clark begin their return home. The explorers Meriwether Lewis and William Clark began their return to St. Louis after completing the first U.S. overland expedition to the Pacific coast. It took them about 2 years to go by foot there and horseback and all the various things that one did back then. Jill, Oregon Trail taught us all as Gen Xers and Millennials what Lewis and Clark went through.
Don't get me started, because apparently
Jill has misremembered. Jill, we had a podcast last year where we brought up Oregon Trail, and Jill misremembered the types of diseases you get on the Oregon Trail.
Let's just say I got a lot of messages from people who were like, what was your family doing on the Oregon Trail?
I think the Oregon Trail game, like the one that was the go-to disease was typhoid. Jill remembered it as syphilis.
Yes.
Am I right? Okay.
Yes. And I think I was thinking dysentery. And for whatever reasons.
All right. Fast forward here to 1943. G.I. Joe is born today. G.I. Joe, not the little figurine. G.I. Joe, one of the most decorated pigeons in military history, is hatched in Algeria. The military used to use pigeons, honing pigeons. They could train them to carry messages. They could give them little messages and carry them by mouth, right, in their beak, and fly them miles away. G.I. Joe, famous because during World War II, there was a battle in Italy where the Allies had called in U.S. fighter jets to bomb a German position. Now, the Allies prematurely, they were able to early take that position from the Germans, but they were not able to communicate back to home base that they had taken the position, and they were worried they were going to basically be struck by friendly fire. Well, they send G.I. Joe the pigeon. He flies 20 miles in 20 minutes in the nick of time, is able to carry that message saying, don't bomb the site anymore, saves 1,000 British troops.
It is crazy that that's a real thing, because I've seen that in the movies and I'm like, is that true that pigeons know where to go and know who to give the message to? It's wild.
Pigeons in New York City get a bad rap, but I feel like looking at some of those pigeons that like you literally have to kick out of the way on the street because they don't move in front of you. They're not G.I. Joe. They don't make some pigeons.
What
like
happened?
They used to.
Yeah, the pigeons have really
or just New York City pigeons, very different from the World War II pigeons. On this day in 1989, one of the worst oil spills in history takes place outside Alaska as the Exxon Valdez runs aground on a reef in Prince William Sound in southern Alaska. 11 million gallons of oil would be spilled into the water, 700 miles of coastline polluted. It was later revealed that the captain of the ship was drinking at the time of the accident and had put an uncertified officer in to steer the vessel. We'll end here with a bit of movie history and the answer to that quote from the beginning about the cannoli and the gun. The Godfather, on this day, 53 years ago, premieres in theaters the 3-hour epic chronicling the lives of the Corleones, the Italian-American crime family led by Vito Corleone, Marlon Brando, released in theaters. It was based on a book. Interestingly, Jill, at the time the movie comes out, Italian-American organizations were very worried about it, saying that this was a slur against Italian-Americans. There were protests. There was a rally in Madison Square Garden saying, this Godfather movie is unacceptable. They have to take this out of theaters. I mean, notably today, I don't think you know a single Italian person who doesn't love The Godfather, but it was interesting, the concern they had at the time. Of course, the incredible cast, James Caan, Al Pacino, Robert Duvall, Diane Keaton, it wins Best Picture, and actually leads to one of the best sequels of all time. Some people actually argue the sequel, at least 2, is better than 1. Godfather 2 would win an Oscar as well for Best Picture. And then you had Godfather 3, not so much.
So I was always under the impression that the line, leave the gun, take the cannoli, that scene was shot at Jones Beach on Long Island. And I was Googling it while you were talking just to make sure that it was true before I spewed that out. And it turns out that no, it was actually filmed in Liberty State Park in New Jersey with the Statue of Liberty in the background. And it is commonly misthought to have been shot at Jones Beach.
Little tri-state trivia for all of you there. Something New Jersey has on New York.
And Bruce Springsteen.
And John Bon Jovi. New Jersey, they have a whole list of stuff. Don't undercut the Garden State.
We have Billy Joel. All right, I'll stop. Okay, thank you guys. That's a whole other podcast conversation. We could get people just to kind of like represent their state. Anyway, thank you all for listening to the Mo News Podcast. If you like what you hear, share this with your friends. Please, it helps us grow. Follow us, subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us kindly in the App Store.
See you guys.
Thanks for listening to the Mo News Podcast. Have a fantastic day. I hope you enjoyed.